Well, good evening. Thanks to all of you who are participating in this evening's program, Beyond Polarization, Building Community Capacity for the Conversations Our Democracy Needs. Before we get started, just a little bit of housekeeping things, just to make you aware, to remind you this presentation is being recorded. If you have friends that were interested in participating this evening but were not able to do so, they can go to the link and view that. In fact, our speaker does recommend that before the next presentation, that if you couldn't see the first, that you remind folks that it would be helpful if they tuned into that before the March the 3rd presentation. Same time, same place. I'd like to let all of you know that this coming Tuesday, March the 2nd, LWVCO is hosting HR 1, the For the People Act, what's included and why it's important. The speakers for this presentation will be Congressman Jason Crow, Congresswoman Diana DeGette, Congressman Joe Neguse, and LWV U.S. Legislative and Policy Coordinator Priya Pandey. So there is no cost for this program, but you do have to register, and you can do that online at lwvcolorado.org. It is my pleasure to be able to introduce our speaker this evening. Dr. Martine Carcasson is a professor in the Communications Studies Department of Colorado State University and the founder and director of the CSU Center for Public Deliberation. For the last 7 years, and his tenure ended in January, he also served as the chair of the National Coalition for Dialogue and Deliberation. So he is eminently qualified to make our presentation this evening. So at this point, I will turn the program over to you, Dr. Carcasson.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for having me. I've always enjoyed working with League of Women Voters. I've worked obviously a lot here with the chapters. I've also done a lot in other parts, especially San Diego. I worked a lot with the San Diego chapter, doing a lot of work trying to build some deliberative resources. So the overall plan here today tonight is mainly me talking. So I'll pull up a slide deck here. I actually just in the chat gave you a link. I popped the slides online as a PDF. So if you want them to see later, some of the slides have a lot of text. I won't cover it all today. So if you want to dig into it a little bit more, I really do hope today is kind of the beginning of a conversation, right? So I'm going to cover a lot of information, kind of laying out a different way to think about how we engage each other as we go through. The next week, I'll spend some of the time next week answering questions. That's why that first link, and maybe Beth, if you want to, since there's new people, if you want to grab those links and cut and paste them again, the first link to Poll Everywhere allows you to ask questions and you can respond to other people's questions. Again, I won't have much time today to cover all those, but that way I can look at them after today and incorporate some of that next week. But what we're planning on doing next week is to actually give you an example of the types of conversations I'll be talking about tonight. So I'll actually have quite a few of my students on next Wednesday. So we'll be able to split you into small groups and have students in each group kind of walk you through a process to give you an example of the type of conversation I'm talking about today, right? But to back up and talk a little bit more about my background and kind of why I'm here, just so you kind of see where I'm coming from, and in some ways how my brain works. My graduate work, my PhD, going back, 18 years ago or so now, is I've always focused on how people talk about tough issues. I've always been really interested in kind of bringing people across perspectives to address the shared problems that they're dealing with. My focus used to be on presidential politics. So my dissertation actually looked at how presidents from Johnson to Clinton talked about welfare and poverty issues. I was trained as an argumentation scholar, which means I'm trained on how people make arguments. What reasons do they give for the positions they have? How do they use evidence? How do they use, whether that's statistics or examples or stories or emotions or all the different ways people engage. I grew weary of national politics, as many of y'all can probably imagine, right? I started getting more and more frustrated recognizing that the processes I was looking at, particularly at the national level, they weren't helping us address the problems that we cared about. It seemed like a game that people were playing. So when I got to CSU 18 years ago, I shifted my work from a national focus to much more of a local focus. And I shifted my kind of academic work from being more of a critic or a commentator, talking more about how other people were talking about issue, to become much more of a practitioner. So I started the organization called the Center for Public Deliberation in 2006. It serves as an impartial resource for the Northern Colorado community. I actually train undergraduate students as facilitators. And then we work for the city and the school district and the university and the League of Women Voters and United Way and so forth to design and run events in the community to help us have the kind of conversations that I feel democracy requires. Democracy is hard work. We have to have some really tough conversations and conversations with people we disagree with. And as part of what I'll talk about today, that's not how our brains are wired, right? So for us to be able to have the conversations we need to have, we need to change how, we need to build capacity in our communities and change the ways we do things. So that's the heart of what I'm talking about today, is to kind of go all the way through with that. So I'm going to share my screen now. And on the slides, my email's on the slide, and my email is also in the Q&A document. So feel free, you can post questions there, but if you want a direct answer to your question, feel free to shoot me an email with this as you go through. I've got a few of you I can see on the side, but not too many of you. And it's really hard for me to watch the chat while I'm presenting, right? So I'll look at the chat afterwards. But if there's something particularly relevant in the chat, someone might need to kind of jump in and kind of stop me in a way as we're kind of going through. But the overall presentation I'm giving in today is I'm going to try to really dig into two questions. In this slide deck, it's really kind of developed from the first 2 days of my class as I start my students off to kind of think about the why behind the CPD. Why do we do these things? Why is it so important? Typically, I've already deleted a lot of slides to get it kind of fit today. I probably should have deleted more, so I'll go pretty quick. But like I said earlier, I hope this is the beginning of a conversation. If something sparks you here, I'm happy to kind of dig in a lot more in different ways. But I'm going to ask two questions or answer two questions today. One is, why are we so polarized? Why are we so angry? Why are we so good at talking past each other and frustrating each other? So I'll dig into that probably about the first 15, kind of 20 minutes. And then, get to the better news in a sense. Okay, what can we do about that? Particularly, what can we do in local communities, right? Some of the things I talk about, yes, I think, hopefully we can bring them to scale and we can change national politics. There's a lot of my friends, my colleagues across the country that's what they focus on. That's not what I focus on, right? In some ways, my long-term goal is the more and more we can get individual communities to transform how they talk to each other and transform the connections that they have, the more and more communities will demand more at the state level and demand more at the national level, and we'll grow a new kind of leader who knows how to engage people in a different way, and those leaders hopefully will make their way up to the state and national level and change, right? So I'm not starting with how do we change national politics. I'm starting how do we change our communities to have the conversations we need to have for democracy to work, and then hopefully that will start growing, right? So first, digging into that first question, why are we so polarized? About 5 years ago now, I've been doing this work for about 15 years with the center. We're doing 20 or 30 projects a year of getting people in the same room together to have tough conversations with my students, kind of leading the way in a sense. And about 5 years ago, I decided to do a pretty deep dive into new research in brain science and social psychology, basically to help us understand why we're so polarized. Why with certain issues that we dealt with, it was so hard to kind of get people off their perspective, right? And in some ways, if we got them in the room, we can have a good conversation. But with some of our toughest issues, the broader conversation, the conversation in the newspaper and the community stage is so polarized. So I read quite a few books. These are just a few of them. If what I do here the next 20 minutes is really interesting to you, I got about a 60-page report that I did that summarizes this with all the sources. I'm happy to send to you. I also have a 5-page summary if that's kind of more your speed. But here are some of the kind of key books that I looked at. I just love some of these titles. The Hidden Forces That Shape Our Decision. This one won a Nobel Prize on how we're wired to think fast, We're cognitive misers. We don't like to think, but we have the ability to think slow in certain situations, right? This one, you are not smart, and the 46 other ways you're deluding yourself, how your brain distorts and deceives. My favorite title is What Makes Your Brain Happy and Why You Should Do the Opposite. Jonathan Haidt's work has really been useful to really think about opposing political perspectives, how it's so hard and for them to kind of get together. This is kind of one of the classic books. I think it was probably written in the mid 90s. One of the first books that really explored why, if all the information shows one side's right and the other side's wrong, why does that not change the conversation? Why do facts no longer seem to work to change minds? And we'll get into that a little bit more today. This is a little bit more newer version of that from Tom Nichols to looking at the role of expertise in society in some important ways. Looked at another couple hundred academic articles. Those titles are never quite as interesting. But overall, kind of what I learned from this deep dive for a couple years, unfortunately, I learned mainly bad news. And one way to kind of summarize what I'll be talking about the first half of this talk is our brains, unfortunately, are much more wired for polarization than they are for deliberation or engagement, right? The natural tendencies, there's negative quirks in our brain that are pretty easily activated that unfortunately tend to dominate in some ways. Now, next 20 minutes is going to be pretty dark and pretty negative, but there's a lot of good news to come, right? So we'll talk a little bit more about the flip side of this research, some of the good aspects of our brain that I truly believe good process design, engaging people in better ways can help us avoid triggering all these negative things and actually tap into these positive things. And that's the heart of what we're trying to do with the work that we do with the CPD and that we're trying to kind of develop across the country. So big key themes from all this research about our brains is first that we crave certainty and consistency. Our brains are almost wired that once we make a decision, our brain protects that decision and seeks out confirming evidence of that decision and protects from outside people telling us that we're wrong. Right? The second is we're suckers for a good versus evil narrative. We love the simple story. This is basically like an anthropological fact across all cultures, across all times, that we like to see the world through kind of good versus evil kind of story. We love heroes and victims and villains, and we interpret the world through that lens in so many different ways. Right? This is actually the Disney villains. I've got 3 children, so I've watched lots of Disney movies in my life. And if you think about at least the classic Disney movies, the reason Disney is so incredibly popular is because it gives our brains exactly what they want, which is a simple kind of good versus evil story. Often evil's winning in the middle, right? So we all get nervous, but good makes a comeback and vanquishes evil, and we live happily ever after. And we're constantly kind of reinforcing that inherent tendency for our brain to see the world through that simple lens. And we teach our kids over and over again, if there's a tough problem, the only thing you have to do to solve the problem is find the evil person behind it. Find the devil figure, which you'll see later on why that can be so problematic. Third is that we're groupish. Now, the popular culture, they kind of use tribal, political tribes and tribalism and so forth. I'd rather avoid kind of assuming tribalism is such a negative word. But the overall idea here, and we'll come back to this later, is that we're actually not that selfish. We're not individualistic as a species. As a species, we're designed to be in groups. We're designed to be social. And so these 3 things work together pretty powerfully. That we like to see ourselves in teams, we're in groups. We like to think our group is good and their group is evil, and we're certain of it. Right? And those 3 things combine and work together to really influence the 4th one, which is particularly important to me, again, as an argumentation scholar, as someone who's looking at how people make arguments and how evidence should help us make better decisions. And our brains are really good at filtering and cherry picking evidence to support our views, to pull that out. So this aspect of the research was really important. So I dove into it quite a bit in the paper. So I kind of developed this model in a sense of these stages of motivated reasoning. The term motivated reasoning kind of gets back to this notion that we're motivated to think in a certain way, right? We like to think that we're motivated for accuracy or for truth, right? But generally, the way our brains are wired is we're motivated to protect our team, right? To protect the decisions that we've already made. So these stages are chronological. They kind of build on each other. When I started doing this work 5 years ago, these terms that you'll see on the right side of the screen were all brand new to me, right? Of course, the 2016 presidential campaign, was motivated reasoning on steroids in lots of ways. So I think a lot of these terms, you'll recognize them now, but we're learning more and more, why it's so hard to have these tough conversations because of these natural tendencies, right? So the first stage is, we tend to be biased. We're motivated to get news, get information from people that, you're going to tell us what we want to hear, right? What news channel you watch to, who you have conversations with, those type of filters. Even if you don't do that personally on purpose, Facebook and Google will do that for you, right? On your home computer, if you Google something and you're always clicking the progressive link or the conservative link, Google learns, they like progressive stuff, and they give you that more and more, right? So your Google and your friend's Google from the other side of the aisle is going to look completely different because they're trying to kind of give you what you want. But that starts creating this filter that you're only seeing certain things, right? The second stage is probably the most important, and confirmation bias, I imagine, is a term a lot of y'all heard. And it's just a basic kind of brain feature that our brain is wanting to confirm our prior assumptions, right? And disconfirm kind of any against assumption. So we're biased on what gets to our ears in the first stage, and then we're biased on how we interpret, how we make sense of that information. This is one paragraph from Jonathan Haidt's work, actually interpreting something earlier from Tom Gilovich. So two of the books I showed earlier. But this paragraph has kind of haunted me the last 4 or 5 years as I've watched national politics. But it's a basic summary in the sense of when we want to believe something, the question we ask in our brain is, can I believe it? And if there's just a shred of evidence that supports that, like, we're done. We can stop thinking and close our minds. But the opposite, if we don't want to believe something, the question we ask is, must I believe this? And the rule of evidence there is, hey, if there's just a little evidence that kind of disproves that, then we can stop thinking. So you can see how two different perspectives, in a way, something happens in the real world, but it's completely interpreted in different ways by different sides. And that just, fuels the polarization, fuels the misunderstanding more and more, making it more and more difficult for us, again, to have the conversations we need to have. The next one on this, the backfire effect, is really scary one, particularly those that like data and like information and want facts to be important. We're learning in some ways that in some situations, particularly when we're polarized, when we're in an adversarial environment, and obviously our politics right now are hyper partisan, hyper adversarial in a way, we've seen quite a bit of evidence, not in all cases, but we've seen evidence that if I'm trying to convince you you're wrong, in some ways, the stronger my argument is, the higher the quality of my sources and my evidence, the more you might backfire and dig in. Right? And the way it works is your brain is still trying to find some flaw in my argument and is normally successful in doing so. So at the end of our exchange, you're thinking, that expert PhD brought the best information. He was so confident and I just blew it out of the water. But that's some scary research that we're seeing more and more, that we're learning that, again, facts aren't going to change the conversation. People, and in some ways we're seeing high quality information, when it's injected into a polarized debate, unfortunately tends to polarize things more, because each side cherry picks and picks what they want out of the evidence and ignores the rest. So we're learning, again, that facts aren't going to save us. Right? Now, I'm not saying facts don't matter. And a big part of my work is, how do we change the conversations we're having? How do we move away from these hyper adversarial processes? Because when we have different kind of processes, facts matter again. Facts can help us make the tough decisions we need to do. But the research is showing more and more why we can't. Facts aren't going to get us out of us on their own. Next 3 stages, I'm going to go really quick. But there's also lots of biases on how we store information, how we keep information. We are, going back to the good versus evil narrative, we are narrative creatures. We think in terms of story. We remember in terms of story. One way to summarize these first 20 minutes, in a sense, is our brains are really good at getting any new information to kind of fit within our existing narrative, rather than ever allow new information to challenge that narrative, right? And that's the power that this has. This is just a quote. This is George Bush when he was giving a eulogy of Dallas police officers 2 or 3 summers ago who were ambushed, right? but I think it captures quite a bit what I'm seeing in the research, this notion of too often we judge other groups by their worst examples while judging ourselves by our best intentions. Because that story that we have in our head about our team and about their team and good versus evil colors so much that we're seeing in things. Then there's biases on how we actually make decisions. And then there's even biases on what we remember and what stories are top of mind that we can kind of share. Right? So all that goes together to this kind of key point where our brains, we like simplicity, we like certainty, we like simple stories. As we gain new information, that just kind of fortifies those assumptions, and our brain is really bad at dealing with value dilemmas, tensions, and tough choices. Remember that, because we're going to get back to why that is so critical and why it makes it so difficult for us to have the conversations we need to have. Right? So this is kind of the first part of what we're learning individually about brains. I'm going to go in a little bit now, so then how that individual person now goes out in the world and tries to have conversations about tough issues and politics. So I've been building this model, vicious cycle in the sense of it's a negative feedback loop. Some of the good news is I do believe this is a model that exaggerates polarization. I don't think we're nearly as divided and angry as we actually are. Right? I think there's lots of processes that take some differences that we have and then exaggerate them and explode them and kind of lead us down a path. So that's the good news that we'll hear later on, that this polarization isn't nearly as difficult to overcome as we might think, right? But if we start with what I just walked through, individual biases, we got kind of the blinders on, right? Then when someone with blinders on tries to have a conversation with someone with opposing blinders on, it doesn't tend to go very well, right? We have that negative reaction. Our brains don't work well. If you like TED Talks, Catherine Schultz has a really nice TED Talks about this if you Google it. But this is a book that she wrote that's all about how do we deal with people when they tell us that we were wrong. The short version of the book is badly, right? Our brain, we don't like being told that we're wrong. She walks through a whole process that I'll do really quickly. But, the first step is we just assume they think we're wrong because they just don't know what we know, right? Ignorance seems like a nasty word, but it just means unaware. They haven't been told yet. So then we tell them, right? We inform them, we educate them, but they still don't change their mind, right? So then we have to upgrade to this idiot assumption, right? So this assumption of, okay, now they know what I know, but they're just not as sharp as me, right? But eventually the conflict still doesn't go away. So she argues that we have to kind of upgrade to this evil assumption. Evil is a little strong of a word for me, but I think the overall idea here is we make assumptions about the other people's motives. And this is huge from a communication and a trust perspective. Basically what our brain is telling us, they know that I'm right, but they refuse to admit it because they have some other hidden motive. And once we go there in a conversation, once we're assuming the people that we're engaging or arguing with are not playing fair, that they don't, that they're hiding kind of their motives and they're not, yielding to the force of the better argument, and we make those assumptions about their motives, all communication breaks down, right? All of a sudden you can't have a conversation. And clearly that's where we are in some ways in our country, where half the country can't have a conversation with the other half because of the simplistic assumptions that they have in their head about each other, right? Then it goes to what I call the Russell effect, which is built off of this meme from philosopher Bertrand Russell. The whole problem with the world is that fools and fanatics are always so certain of themselves and wiser people are so full of doubt. My argument here is the notion that some of the loudest voices in our issues are the ones that have the strongest blinders on. Not always, right? But generally, there's lots of people that are paid very well to have a simplistic opinion and to share that simplistic opinion and to give people what they want to hear. And we're getting more and more of that, right? At the city level, the people, often a lot of people that are always in line at that microphone at city council, right? The reason they're there is because they're so sure that they're right and everyone else is an idiot that they want to kind of scream it from the rooftops, right? But those people that see different sides of the issue, people that struggle with consequences and unintended consequences and so forth, there's often not a place for them, right? To stand up in front of 100 people with a microphone, it's easy to do when you're sure you're right. It's hard to do when you're, I see this side and I see this, so this is part of what we talk about is so many of our processes to engage tough issues reward kind of the wrong kind of communication, right? And feed into the problems that we have with our brains, right? Then you add the internet, which is wonderful in so many ways. It allows me to speak to you fine people, even though we can't be close to each other these days. But the internet also, unfortunately, all those negative quirks of human nature I touched on earlier, it kind of exacerbates those, right? It makes it so easy to gather around like-minded people. It's so easy to kind of share the worst examples. Now, I mentioned cherry picking earlier. I think everyone knows cherry picking is you're just picking the examples that fit your perspective. The new word we're hearing more and more is called nut picking. Right, so nut picking is picking the worst example of the other side, right, and sharing that with all your friends, right, to say this is what those people think, right. And the internet, Twitter, Facebook, and all those are just wonderful at just highlighting the best of your side and the worst of their side, and that just again drives us more and more apart. Then you have our political system. I won't go through this whole slide. You can kind of look a little bit more later, but the really quick summary of this is that we have a political system that, unfortunately, from an argumentation perspective, rewards really bad arguments and punishes good ones. And the issues that we're dealing with are so difficult already that with that kind of laid on top of it. I mean, I would almost, as a process designer, my whole life is about designing processes to help people come together across perspectives and work on shared problems. The national system is basically the opposite. It's almost as if someone designed the system purposely to spark the worst possible conversations, right? And to make it so hard for us to deal with problems. So you understand now why I shifted from national to local at the beginning of my career. Otherwise, my career would have been pretty depressing. So you look at, so many of our processes, just have this one at a time at the microphone, lots of opportunities for individuals to kind of, share their opinion. But basically kind of sharing their biases in a sense. So it ends out looking a little bit like this. We'll see some different models of this later. And then lastly, unfortunately, the media loves all this, right? The media thrives on conflict. The media, to be honest, knows the human nature, knows that we prefer the simple story, knows that we prefer the drama, that we love the victims and the villains, and it feeds us that, right? And this negative feedback loop kind of, gets worse and worse and worse. It's a vicious cycle. And it leads to these things in the middle of where we are right now, right? That we're so angry, mean-spirited in a way that we really haven't seen, just the joy of kind of punishing the other side. But in particular, as we get more and more to making easy assumptions about other people's motives, that fuels conspiracy theories. And most of all, that last bullet point, all this processes makes it almost impossible for us to do the work of democracy, which is coming together as communities to address our shared problems. Bottom line of all this, now, luckily I'm shifting now from all the negative to, okay, so what do we do about all this for the rest of the presentation today? But the end of this is that notion that when you look at how we engage people, whether it's the national model or how we engage often in community and certainly social media, once you understand the brain science and the social psychology, it's abundantly clear that most of the processes we have are almost designed to bring out the worst in us and never tap into the good of us, which I'll be introducing here in a second. Right? So, second half of this presentation, look at it, right exactly at 6:30, is, okay, so what do we do about this, right? So I'll be pretty quick laying out. We'll dig into this a lot more again next week and give you some examples of how to do this. But I'm going to talk for this one in kind of three parts. The first part is this notion of, and this is more of an individual or for leaders, right? So to adopt a wicked problems mindset is a way of thinking about the world, as a tool, as a lens through which to see kind of the problems that we have. And hopefully, if you buy my argument the next 30 minutes, you'll have this tool in your toolkit and start playing with it a little bit next week. The second point I'll make here is, shifting from the individual to kind of more of the events, like how do we engage each other? How do we change the way we the way we do process, the way we do politics? So instead of sparking the worst and not the best, we flip that, right? And we find ways of avoiding triggering those negative aspects of human nature and tap into the best of us in a lot of ways. And then lastly, and this is particularly important to organizations like League of Women Voters, how do we do the big picture of building capacity in our communities for these kind of conversations and making them ongoing conversations? So first I'm going to dig into wicked problems. And this is I'm curious, I don't know how many of y'all have heard that term before or not. I've been playing with this term. It was initially developed in the early 70s, kind of before me in a sense, but it's a particular way, the way I use it again is a lens through which to see problems. It's the idea that if I'm struggling with an issue, I can step back and say, if I look at this as a wicked problem, how might that change how I think about this issue, right? So you see the definition here. The heart of wicked problems for me is that they're problems that inherently involve competing underlying values, paradoxes, and trade-offs, that there's not a scientific, there's not a technical solution to them, because these values are in tension. Best way to explain this is with an example, right? So this is one of the ones that we've been doing up here in northern Colorado for quite a bit. Water is a wicked problem. We don't have enough water. It doesn't rain very much. We get a lot of water in May and June when all the snow melts. For the last 100 years, we've built up an agricultural community because of irrigation ditches and reservoirs and so forth. But we're a wonderful place to live. So we're getting more and more people to northern Colorado, and they want water. We're learning more about the hydrology of the river, and we're probably overworking our river. It's not as healthy as it needs to be. So we should be leaving water in. And so there's all these kind of pools. So we were asked by the CSU Water Institute, kind of the experts and the Community Foundation of Northern Colorado, say, hey, we need a better conversation about water. We need to engage this issue in a very different way. It was starting to get nasty, right? It was starting, organizations and different perspectives and, letters to the editor and so forth. So what we did initially, we had a kickoff meeting. We had about 300 people there. I had little half sheets of paper asking people open-ended questions about what's important to you when you think about the Poudre River and water in northern Colorado, and collect, it's called concern gathering, connect all these perspectives and what people cared about. And I create these wicked problem slides. This is one of the key tools that I use, which is my, as a deliberative practitioner, as an analyst looking at this from an impartial perspective, to try to capture what are the things that people care about on this issue and to try to frame these positively. And this one shows a wicked problem in a couple different ways. So one is, if you look at these 9 things one at a time, these are all good things, right? When you talk about wicked problem, what you're trying to do is you're shifting from the easy assumption that problems are caused by wicked people, and you're putting the wickedness in the problem, right? So it's the opposite of what Disney does, right? That gives us the simple kind of evil character behind everything. So one is these one at a time. These are all pretty good things. It's not that there's bad people that have bad values that are dominating. The wickedness is the second part. These things don't fit together very well, right? Some of them do, right? Some of them are connected, but for quite a few of these, there's a natural tension. And the more that we focus on one of those boxes, it's going to inherently make it harder to focus on another box, right? The problem is the dominant conversations we have, because of the way our brains work, because of the way most of our groups work, what we tend to do is pick one of these values at a time. And because we want to frame it as a simple good versus evil story, that I care about the health of the river, right? So if anyone disagrees with me, it's because you hate rivers, right? And that's a simple narrative, and that mobilizes people that agree with me, but it doesn't help us solve the problem, right? So the kinds of conversations that we need to have about the issues that we're dealing with is to identify those underlying values, put them on the table, recognize the tensions between them, and spark the conversation, this broader conversation about how do we negotiate these tensions better, right? And that tends to be kind of one of 3 types of conversations. The long-term conversation we have to have in our communities is, okay, how do we balance these better, right? How do we find each one? And I'm not saying each one of these is equally important, right? We have to make some tough choices. We have to make some prioritization, but overall, we're trying to find the right balance. In some cases, a value might kind of get left behind, and sometimes a value might dominate too much. And so a lot of ways, the quality of our community is going to be defined in some sense by the quality of our ongoing conversation about this kind of balancing process. So balancing is this long-term conversation about values. The short-term conversation is when there's a value that dominates too much or gets left behind. That's when we have to kind of have a tough prioritization conversation, a recalibration in a way, right? And we're shifting our values. When 9/11 happened, right, we shifted our values. Security became more important. We thought about things differently, right? The events of the last, obviously with COVID, that's elevated certain issues about public health. When we had Black Lives Matter and those type of things, it elevated kind of concerns about justice and equity. Right? So again, it's a constant conversation that we're trying to have to make some tough choices about, but it's not taking one value by itself, right? It's a value within the kind of, a broad range of values might be elevated, recognizing there's going to be some trade-offs there, right? Recognizing it's harder going to have more of something without potentially having some tensions inherent in there. And then the third conversation, which is the best possible conversation, is a transcending conversation. When there's two values in tension, if we can find ways of innovating, getting creative and going beyond that and finding ways of having a win-win. And I'll give you an example of that one in a few minutes. The problem again is we don't tend to have these balancing, these prioritizing, or these transcending conversations naturally. We need help. Right? Our brains aren't wired to have these kind of conversations. And what we'll be doing next week is giving you a chance to have kind of one of these conversations kind of going through, right? So I've got quite a few of these. I won't walk through these as extensive as I did that one. This is one that we did out in Steamboat Springs, helping that community think about what do we want local food. And once again, aspects of a wicked problem. Each of these, one of them by themselves, are good things. They just don't fit together very well, right? So how do we kind of address those tensions, put them on the table, and find ways of working through to make better decisions that find a better balance between these as we're going through. Healthcare in some ways is so incredibly complicated, but one way you can think about it is we want those three things, and those three things don't fit together very well, right? But most conversations on healthcare tend to take one or two of those at a time, and again, frame things in ways that people disagree with you, just have bad values or rejecting a positive value. The sustainability, in a sense, is in a way a wicked problem. The notion of the triple bottom line. So Fort Collins is officially a triple bottom line city. And what that means is any kind of major policy that goes through the city has to be seen through the lens of what's the impact on the economy, what's the impact on people, and what's the impact on the environment, right? And I like to show this one as an example because the traditional, the environment versus the economy, traditionally those are against each other, right? It's an adversarial kind of relationship. But something like green jobs, which is so important to CSU and Fort Collins, is an example of transcending that tension. All of a sudden, we're creating wealth and we're creating jobs in ways that are good for the environment. And groups that were traditionally kind of at odds with each other, all of a sudden see themselves as partners kind of working together. And we've changed the conversation, right? That transcending conversation is so important for us to deal with wicked problems well in our communities. But we just don't naturally have that conversation. This is a new one I'm kind of playing with, of looking, particularly at the reaction to COVID, which we've struggled with so much. You would think a global pandemic would finally be the thing that brought us together, but obviously you've noticed even this pandemic in some ways has found ways of driving us further apart because of the inherent polarization, the frames that we see the world. This one I play with a little bit different because I purposely put public health in the very middle and a larger font to clearly imply of these different values as we think about it. Public health has to be the priority. It has to, be number one. But that doesn't mean these other things that people care about are irrelevant. And if they care about one of those values, it means they don't care about public health, right? If we were able to, at the beginning of COVID, to see COVID as a wicked problem, or the response to COVID as a wicked problem, and how can we work together to balance these concerns versus just ridicule people for having concerns other than public health, I think it would have been a very different conversation, right? And then lastly, we'll do the poll here in a second, who is helping with that. But so here's the preamble to the Constitution, right? Embedded in the preamble are some pretty big values. If we translate those values into a little bit more modern terms, here are 5 big American values: justice, security and safety, equality, freedom for us, and freedom for future generations. My argument here is democracy itself is a wicked problem. If you look at these, take these one at a time, these are all pretty good things, right? The joke I always make is, and I can't see all of y'all, so we can't quite do this, but if I asked you, which do you prefer, justice or injustice, right? I think everyone would probably pick the first one, right? So if we take these one at a time, particularly if we keep them abstract, we don't define them, these are all good things. They're, a value by definition is a good thing. But the reality is these don't fit together very well, right? So I'm going to do a quick little exercise. If you look now at American values, and these, there's a lot of other American values. We'll dig into quite a few more next Wednesday. But if we just take this 5 as a little set, if you want to go ahead and pop the first poll question on there, I think it should just kind of appear on your screen, right? Yeah, there we go. Which of these values, I guess you got 2 questions on there. I think you can answer both.
Oh.
So the first question is, which of these values is most important to you? If you had to pick one of these to be on the top of the list, if I asked you to define these, we would get 20 different definitions, and we'll actually do a little bit of that next week, right? But for what the word means to you, if you had to pick one of these to be more important than the other 4, what would it be? I'll give y'all a minute here to do that. Did it pop up on everyone's screen? And then the next question is, what would you have on the bottom? Got half of you so far. I've done this with so many different groups. It's so fascinating always to look at. Normally I just see them at the very end. I don't get to see them kind of develop. I don't know if y'all can see them. Maybe since I'm the co-host, I can kind of see them developing, right? I think that's everyone. We got a few of y'all out there. Maybe another 5 seconds or here, so.
Sure.
I think I can do it right. Can you go ahead and display the results then to everybody?
Okay.
Yeah. So that's how it came out. I don't know if you can see on my screen or if you're kind of seeing yourself. It's actually pretty interesting. I got myself in trouble a little bit here. This is a different group. I've been asking this question. I've probably asked this question 300 times over the last 15 years. Most of the classes I teach and the workshops and those type of things. And this is actually one of the few times no one in the group picked freedom for future generations, which is interesting. I normally can say, and I think this is probably about the 5th time out of the 300 that not every single value was picked on the first question, right? Every single value was picked on the second one. And actually some pretty good balance on the second one kind of going across, right? But the overall idea here is, and if we take these one at a time, they're all good things, but they don't fit together very well, right? I mean, some of these values, there's quite a few tensions, and so when you look at something from a wicked problems perspective, you're kind of doing 2 things. In some ways, you're establishing a lot of common ground that we all agree these are good things, but then you're also establishing quite a few differences that we have lots of different ways that we rank these in a sense. And those rankings make a difference because there's natural tensions between here, right? So if you look at just those 5 values, freedom and security, I think, is a tension that's pretty easy to see, right? Every time we travel or those type of things, how do we find the right balance there? Freedom and equality, which are often kind of the 2 biggest kind of American values in lots of different ways. From an economic perspective, the more freedom we have, the more inequality we tend to have, right? So if we want equality, we have to violate freedom. So there's a tension there. Freedom for us and freedom for future generations is like a primary tension in the environmental movement. And justice, which most of y'all picked, which is what I would pick too. I like to think of justice in some ways as a balance. If you get the tension between freedom and equality right, you get fairness, you get justice, right? That's one way to kind of think about it. So, but generally, in a sense, these values are critical to underlining so many of the conversations that we tend to have, some of the arguments that we have, but we don't tend to think about them that much. We don't tend to define them. We don't tend to ask each other what those mean to you, and we certainly don't see the tensions between them. Again, freedom and equality, for example, are used as the basis of probably 95% of political ads are based in some ways implicitly on freedom or equality, but we rarely talk about the tension between them, right? Or similarly, these are the way my brain works is whenever I'm asked to do a new project, I'm inherently looking for the tension, right? To bring out the underlying tension that, or sometimes several that are at the heart of the issue that our brains tend to avoid. Or strategically, our brains, frame purposely so people don't kind of see it in a way. So many of our dominant voices don't talk about the tensions. They're picking one value at a time. Well, the work that we do more and more as we really want to engage tough issues from different perspectives, we want to identify that tension, put it on the table, and help us work through that, right? So overall, when you start seeing things through wicked problems and looking for the underlying values and the tensions, we have to be able to be able to do that well. You have to be able to talk to each other. You have to tap into human creativity, and eventually you have to have broad collaborative action. There's government can't come up with a solution to a wicked problem. Individuals can't. It requires to cut across public, private, nonprofit lines. That's why organizations like League of Women Voters can be so important as a civic organization, to be a host, to be a catalyst, to help us have these conversations and kind of shift how we talk about things, right? So overall, when I talk about the wicked problems mindset as an individual, particularly for our leaders, the key tenets of this is to presume wicked problems, not wicked people. I'm not saying there's not wicked people, right? But your brain's going to go there very quickly, right? So if you try to kind of train yourself to look for the wickedness in the problem, how does that change the conversation from the very beginning, right? To become more comfortable with uncertainty. To push back on your brain's tendency to want things to be simple, to want certainty, and to live, that it's okay to kind of, to have that kind of humility, to have that kind of vulnerability. Some of y'all might be familiar with Brene Brown's work, which really kind of taps into this notion. I've really, been playing a lot with leadership groups of thinking, how do we shift from this traditional view of leadership of, I've got charisma, I've got a strong opinion, I can rally the troops and fire them up. Which can still be important in certain situations. But the next generation of leaders, leadership in the 21st century is going to be more like the right side of the screen. That our leader's superpower is the ability to bring people together across perspectives, and they're process people that can help people have the kind of conversations they need to have. That's very different kind of, it seems odd, right? But we want leaders that are comfortable with uncertainty versus, being confident and kind of pushing people. We need, as I've said several times, to focus on, when you're engaged in a conversation, instead of trying to win the conversation and try to prove that they're wrong and you're right, if you focus all your energy in having a better conversation, learning how to ask good questions, being the facilitator in a sense, you'll see how much better the results will be. Because as we see from the research, trying to prove someone that they're wrong and throwing information out there tends to backfire. It's going to make it worse, right? So instead of trying to win a bad argument, how do you change the conversation in important ways? Put your energy towards identifying, engaging, and negotiating those tensions. And eventually, what we're trying to do in our communities is to create, to build capacity for our communities to be these learning communities, to keep these ongoing conversations, this long-term process of how do we balance between all these different values. The democracy itself is an ongoing conversation. It's not just a mechanism to make decisions and vote in elections. John Dewey talked about democracy being a way of life. And that way of life for me is this notion that we have lots of values that we care about. They don't fit together very well. How do we have the conversations we need to have, to do the constant process of recalibrating, prioritizing, ideally transcending in certain situations. So that's the individual thing. So then, what does that mean? I know I got 10 minutes here. I think I'm gonna be okay. So how do we change the way we act? Earlier, I shared these are the negative aspects of human nature that came out of the research. I did mention again, they're stronger, they're easier to trigger, they're more evolved. But there's some good news here, right? The flip side of the groupish coin, we want to be groupish, we want to be our teams. Unfortunately, some of the worst things humans have ever done in history was because of that, because we defined an us versus them and dehumanized them and justified horrible things. But some of the best things humans have ever done is because the other side of that, we've expanded the us, right? And I know from my own history, shifting from national politics where the us versus them was a red team and a blue team to Fort Collins, maybe the team here is Fort Collins, right? And all of a sudden you have more of an us that you're working together you're tapping into that human nature of wanting to be in a group and wanting to be social and wanting to have purpose in a very positive way instead of, putting so much energy into them, right? Second, we're naturally inherently empathetic. That's a basic aspect of human nature that's triggered by certain types of things. the power, whether Zoom can do this or not is a little bit more complicated, but, before all this, we would be in small round tables talking to each other, and listening to each other's stories, seeing each other's facial expressions. And it's clear time and time again of how hard it is to hate up close when you're having a real conversation with someone in a positive kind of environment that we try to create, right? So that shifts that conversation. Instead of dealing with this caricature of the other side, you're dealing with a real person right then. It taps into empathy of human nature and helps us have these conversations. And probably most importantly, we're inherently pragmatic and creative. As a species, we're problem solvers. The sad thing is we rarely tap into that, because if you have a simple story of all you have to do to solve problems is get rid of the other side, get rid of the devil figure, we don't have to be creative, right? We never tap into that part of our brain. But when we shift from the assumption of wicked people to put the wickedness in the problem, all of a sudden we have the possibility of tapping into this, right? When we get away from face to face against each other to shoulder facing the problem, we tap into this, and it's powerful. And then lastly, while all the negative things are more powerful, the good news is our brain can learn. We can develop new habits. Individuals can develop new habits. Organizations can develop habits. Communities can develop habits. And we start doing more and more. And as we exercise different parts of our brains and we understand the bad parts of our brains that we don't want to trigger, it starts getting easier and easier and easier. Right? Earlier, I shared how facts don't change minds. And unfortunately, often facts can backfire and make it worse in a polarized environment. What we do know from the research is what does change people's minds, what leads to a big shift in perspective, what leads to those aha moments are genuine conversations with people they trust and people they respect with a good process. So that's the heart of the work that we're trying to do in the CPD, and we're trying to kind of grow across the country. How do we create more opportunities for people to have these kind of conversations? Instead of the one time of the microphone talking past each other, instead of preaching to the choir, attacking the other side, how do we come together and work on our shared problems? So that's the work that I do that we'll get into a lot more next week. Lots of different words for it. All these words in some ways kind of gets back to this basic notion of you're having a process, right? You're proactive about how you're bringing people together. You're getting away from this one at a time at the microphone, kind of screaming at each other, which tends to be like this, one value at a time, and we never see the tensions between the values. And we're getting more like this. We're creating opportunities. We're acting as a convener, as a catalyst to bring people to kind of together, right? So these are some of the components that you'll see next week in the work that we do. How are we framing the issue? What's the question that we're asking? We're getting away from a simple yes, no to a specific policy, which most of our legislation is driven like that. From a process perspective, that sparks horrible communication, right? So most of our process is more around hey, what should we do about X, right? With X being a problem that we all kind of see as a problem, we might have very distinct ways of addressing it. Most of our events have some sort of background material that they're reacting to. I know y'all often do a good job of this, of researching issues and kind of helping, provide a baseline, being an honest broker of information in your community as the league. Having small groups, so it's not who's comfortable standing up in front of 200 people. You have a small group, hopefully diverse, processes that are designed for people to not tap into those negative aspects of human nature, avoid dating into the best. And then the small group facilitators. That's the heart of my project is I have a small army of students that are taking the class that we can train. So 100 people can show up to a meeting and we can split them up into a whole bunch of small groups or 6 or 7 to have the kind of conversations that we want to have. You'll see some of these aspects kind of next week. One resource, if you're really interested in the nuts and bolts, I've been involved with NCDD, the National Coalition of Dialogue and Deliberation, for many, many years. If you just Google resource guide on public engagement, it's a 20-page document online, has tons of active links that show you all these different ways of engaging people, all these processes that present a very different way to have the conversations we need to have than what we tend to get from our political system. And the heart of the work that I do is to make these 4 big shifts. To shift from the easy assumption of wicked people to get to wicked problems. That helps us shift from adversarial mode to collaborative mode. When we shift from adversarial to collaborative, we shift from the bringing out the worst in human nature, all the negative tendencies of our brain, to actually bring out the best in them. And again, if you're a data person, the fourth shift is when we're in adversarial mode, facts don't work, right? Facts, will rally our side and the other side will dismiss it. When we're in collaborative mode, we want to solve problems, and facts can serve the way we want them to serve, right? So that's the conversation, if you care about data, that we need to do. Right? So the last one, I know I've got a couple minutes here, just real quick, but this directly links, and maybe I'll spend a little bit more time next week about this. The second one was more about, at the meeting, how do you design meetings to engage people differently? This one is more broadly, what kind of community do we want to have? So my job shifts from being a facilitator of a small group to almost like facilitating democracy in a community. Again, I know this kind of taps into what you're wanting to do. If you look at the organizations that we have in our community, some organizations are really good at bringing in like-minded people together. It's called bonding capital, going back to Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone. And then some organizations should be good at bringing people across perspectives. We need those bridging institutions. But what's happened as we've polarized more and more, the groups on the top that used to be kind of polarizing are now hyper polarizing. These groups in the middle, I mean, if you look at these middle ones, they used to be seen as neutral. They used to be seen as apolitical. Now more and more they're seen as very political. In some ways, the media is one of the ones that's dividing us more than ever in some senses. And the ones on the bottom, these are the ones that we have to solidify and recreate, right? So I'm a big fan of League of Women Voters because I know the importance of bridging institutions that are civic organizations that are designed particularly to bring people together across perspectives to have these kind of conversations, right? So these are the groups that I work with to try to kind of build their capacity, create new bridging institutions and reinforce existing bridging institutions, because they're the ones that are going to really help us. And at the same time, working for these more polarizing ones to kind of bring them back. Into thinking, I work a lot with our local newspaper, how you can be a resource for better conversations versus feeding some of the polarization, right? So now it goes from the individual meeting to the broader conversation. How do we think about the ecology of our community? How do we think of it as a deliberative system? And how does that help us talk about things differently? And how can, in my organization, or I'm working with the League of Women Voters, or working with the United Way or the Community Foundation, how can we intervene in our community to elevate how we talk about issues? To give strength, to turn things around so we don't have the situation of bad arguments get punished, or good arguments get punished and bad arguments, that we turn that around, that we're not tapping in to the negative. So last two slides, ending right on time. I'll stick around if there want to be some questions, but I want to honor y'all's time. I showed you this. This is a negative cycle that the research shows of when we have these adversarial conversations. The good news is there's a virtuous cycle that we're seeing more and more in communities. That when we give people an authentic opportunity to engage tough issues, particularly at the local level, we start developing mutual understanding. We understand each other more. We still might disagree, certainly, but we seem reasonable. We don't have this caricature of the other side. When we do that, we start building respect and trust in those relationships that allow us to have these conversations. Then all of a sudden, instead of processes being a chance for you just to express your opinion, coming together gives you a chance to refine your opinion, to learn from each other, to tap in to the aspect of human nature as problem solvers. And then that builds up the potential in our community for the collaboration, the co-creation across perspective, across public, private, nonprofit lines. That's so critical. And we do see in the research that this is a virtuous cycle. The more you do this, the more you build up the habits, the more you're able to do this kind of easier and easier. So with that, like right there, right at 7 o'clock, hopefully you had a chance. I'll leave it open. If you want to, pop some questions, I can kind of look at those over the next week. You also have my email, if you like as well, and the link to the PDF. But what we'll do next week, I'll spend some time answering questions to see what kind of came up. But then we'll get a chance to have a deeper conversation about values and kind of going through an example of this small group deliberative process that fits a lot of those components that I mentioned. With that, I'll take a drink of water.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate it, Dr. Carcasson. We are looking forward to next week and learning more from you. I have found this to just be fascinating and completely inspiring. And it just really makes me wonder if we can't use these skills as the league to really enhance our trusted reputation and work to break down the polarization that's really tearing our country apart right now. So I thank you again, and looking forward to next week. I would like to remind everyone that next week's workshop will be 2 hours, not 1. Is that correct, Martine?
I mean, we could make it 2 hours. I was thinking it was the same, but.
Oh, great, great. I had thought that, I don't know why I thought that. Something in the, great. 1 hour is just fine. 2 hours is a little long on Zoom.
Yeah.
So I appreciate that. But we're looking forward to small group work. I want to thank all attendees here. We don't often charge for events, and you all paid a little bit to attend, and we really appreciate that. That allowed us to cover our costs here. We actually made an $8 profit. So, woohoo! Really appreciate that. And that's about all we're looking for. We do not intend for these to be fundraisers. We just want to get as much information and to you all as possible. And the more we can cover those costs, obviously, the more we can do. So we appreciate that. We'll see you next week at 6 p.m. You may use the same Zoom link that you used tonight, but you can bet that we'll send it out to you again next week. So see you at 6 o'clock on the 3rd. I hope you will join us on the 2nd as well for our HR1 town hall. And we need to get that passed. We've got to get the John Lewis VRAA passed again, and let's get statehood for Washington, D.C. and all of our citizens there who are being taxed with no representation. So tomorrow we will be sending tonight's recording, as well as Dr. Carcasson's reading lists and various links. So please feel free to share those. We can continue to take registrants for next week's workshop. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful evening. We'll see you next week.
So Dixie was one of the first people. Nice to see you. Are you still up here in Fort Collins, or?
Hold on, I have to unmute. Yeah, I'm in Loveland, but I mostly still do Loveland. Yes, I really want to do it.
You're one of the first people I ever talked about when I started this thing.
Well, I was thinking back to when we began. It's wonderful to see all that you're doing. I definitely am going to email you. I want that 60-page report.
Okay, sure, yeah.
So I'll write to you for that. Thank you. It's very great to see you. You did a great job.
I'm up at my office, and I got to wait 30 minutes to go pick up my kid from theater, right? So
there you go.
I don't need to jump off right away if people want to ask her, but I also don't want people think that they have to stick around. But
yeah.
Did David already leave? I saw his question. I'll work in David's question at the beginning next week.
Thank you for that.
I'm David. That's my.
Oh, okay.
I'm Robin. I don't know why my husband's name is up there.
Yeah, it's just whoever used Zoom last. There's ways. Like for next time, I'm now a Zoom guru because I do everything on Zoom. If you put your cursor on your video in the top right of it, there's a little 3 dots. If you click that, one of the options is rename, so you can change your name.
Oh, thank you. Okay.
Yeah, so is it okay if I answer this question?
Next week or?
No, I can do it right now.
Absolutely, of course, please.
Yeah, one of the ways, so the question, if you can see it, is, do we spend our energy on those who really want to engage and not waste our energy on really convinced of their point of view? Don't want to. Yeah, I mean, part of the way I like to think about this is, I think most people avoid conflict, therefore tend to avoid politics, right? Some people love conflict, right, and love the fight, and they're the loudest voices. And there's a pretty small percentage of people in the world that can deal with conflict well, right? A lot of the work that I'm trying to do, instead of trying to convert the people that love conflict and are sure they're right, I spend a lot more time. How do we get people that are avoiding the conflict to now? The other way to think about this is I train my students as facilitators that if there's someone dominating the conversation, your strategy isn't necessarily to shut them down. Your strategy is to get other people talking, right? Because if that person over talks, that's pretty easy. Like, hold on, let them finish, right? So I kind of see that the same way in the community level, right? Instead of trying to get the loudest, more problematic voices to change how they're doing, I'm trying to get other voices to be involved, right? And I think just the basic point of not having to get up in front of 100 people on a microphone, but being at a table with a facilitator, with an environment, with ground rules that we set up, it allows people to engage. And I think it also does some of those loudmouth people, it seems very odd at one of my events for someone to be there saying, I'm right and you're all dumb, right? It seems so out of place, right? So we've turned it around. So I think in some ways we're transforming those people. But yeah, a lot of our work is we're trying to get people to attend our meetings. We're working to try to get people that don't normally show up to meetings, right? To try to convince them this is different, right? This is, and the nice thing that we've done, this is part of the Virtuous Cycle, is most people come to our first meeting because they care about the issue, right? They're really passionate about the issue, they show up. We have quite a few people that come to our meetings even though they don't care about the issue, right? Because they know the value of it, right? They enjoy the conversation. And that's where it's so powerful for me, because when you have people walking into a meeting that don't have their mind made up, that means they're there to think, right? They're there to solve the problem versus, just to kind of share their opinion. So that's what we're seeing more and more. How do we kind of build that up in a sense that, people are coming in with that mindset of elevating the conversation versus trying to win an argument. Right? Does that get at a little bit what you're doing or what you're asking? Or
Well, it almost sounds like you kind of agree, not that you give up on the people that are so convinced and they don't want to engage, but where you put your energy is to people who want to hear other opinions or want to
and we're trying to give them
a solution.
Yeah. And then part of what we also hope to do, like when I'm recruiting I try to recruit my students to my program. They have to apply and accept, but obviously, lots of really kind of sharp students have strong opinions, right? And for them to play an impartial role. But what I try to kind of convince my students is, if you're so sure you're right? If you're so sure your perspective is the best one, and whether it's the evidence, supports it the most, or it's the best mix of values, like in some ways, if you put all your energy into ensuring it's a better conversation, that should come out, right? So part of what we're hoping for some people that, because we're not wanting people to not be passionate, not to be, we very much see ourselves as like small d democratic activists, right? We want to change the world. We want to move the needle on lots of issues, but we really believe we're going to make more of an impact on our community by being impartial, right? And changing these conversations. So some of it, there is certainly a role for. It's not like we don't want activists to show up to our meetings, right? But hopefully they get a sense of, this is actually going to lead to more positive change, right? Because the reality is, the powers that be that don't want change, they love that we're all yelling at each other, because they know nothing's going to change. But once we start changing the conversations and really start having the conversation we need to have, that's when I think we're going to have more significant shifts that we need to have in our communities.
Thank you.
Well, it was nice seeing you, Dixie.
Yeah, you too, Martine. Well,
I still remember what was that, the transportation plan that we worked on.
Yes, it was the MPO transportation plan.
Yeah. So right when I was starting the CPD, I needed a list of names for a grant that I was applying for. So I cold called the League of Women Voters, and I think you were the spokesperson or something like that. So I was asking you, like, hey, will you sign this document to say that the League of Women Voters supports this organization? And I think you were working as a consultant for another group. You said, hey, can we hire you? So
yeah, we were for the MPO.
So it was a good cold call. So.
Yeah. And interesting, when we did this for Loveland, this was back in the 90s, we had the growth and no growth, which in those days, that was really huge here in Northern Colorado. And one of the things that came out of that was a community facilities plan. where you could get the developers and the no-growthers to agree on something.
Yeah.
Which would have never, that creative idea would have never happened if we hadn't all sat down at the table together.
Yeah, no, I mean, one of the tenets that the best thing you can do with a bad opponent is make them a collaborator, right? How do you figure out a way to shift them, right? And that's not always possible, right? But certainly, you know, that third option of a transcendent conversation, if you're, you know, and this taps into, like, you know, Harvard, you know, Fisher and Urey getting to yes, like, you know, shifting from positions to interest, like the, you know, basic conflict management in a sense is how do we shift these conversations? And unfortunately, at the national level, you know, it's really hard to shift, right? There's a lot of people making a lot of money on that bad conversation, but I think you're seeing more and more at the local level. You can start having a very different kind of conversation, and I do hope the more we do this, that we start expecting more. Right?
Wonderful. Well, wonderful work. I'm so glad you're out there doing this.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I will see you later.
Okay, I'll see you next week.
Bye.
Thanks so much. Good night.
Well, nice job.
No, thank you.
Yes, thank you so much.
Nervous on the time, I landed it right.
Perfect. Yeah.
It's funny. I've done versions of this talk in 15 minutes, and an hour and a half, and 2 hours, and 8 hours. You know, so it's
Wow.
we're just gonna kind of shift to try to kind of fit it in the right time period. But hours a little bit quick, but I think we got there.
Well, a lot of positive feedback.
Yep.
So thanks so much. And let me know if you need anything before next week.
It was like 2 weeks, just an hour, right? Or
I guess so. I don't know why I decided it was 2 hours.
I mean,
I think it's just an hour, Beth.
yeah.
Okay.
I mean, if we got advertised, we could easily do it 2 hours because it's going to be small. You know, it's not going to be a presentation the whole time, right? It's going to be much more interactive.
Right.
And things. But I had it in my head. It was just an hour each time. So.
Okay. Let me look over the contract just to, because that must be where I got that idea. So I will let you know if what it is.
You know what we need to do, because this is how CSU requires us to do it. And for this presentation, I didn't have to prep much because I've given this presentation, right? Whereas since we're doing a process next week, and we'll have to train the students, and so so it might have been we might have said 2 hours for that,
Okay.
because it'll take an hour for us to set it up and an hour to do it.
Okay, great.
But mainly check your advertising if people are signing up for but
No, we didn't say anything about the time. We just said it starts at 6.
Okay.
So
No, actually online, Beth, it says 6 to 7. I'm looking at it on the website. Yeah, it says 6 to 7 for the 2 dates for the 24th and March 3rd. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Kit. Great. Well, I feel good about that then.
All right, well, we'll see you next week.
Excellent. Thanks so much.
Thanks again.